The child shouldn't have been there. Not in that clearing. Not alone. Not breathing in shallow, desperate pulls that barely stirred the frost on her lips. Gideon Pratt stood 3 feet from the small form curled against the base of the oak, his rifle loose in one hand, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. He'd heard something while checking the fence line. Not an animal, something else, something that made the back of his neck prickle with an instinct he hadn't felt in years. When he pushed through the snow-heavy branches, he found her, a Comanche child, maybe 8 years old. Her deerskin clothing was soaked through, her black hair matted with ice, her small hands tucked against her chest. She wasn't moving. But 3 years ago, Gideon had buried his own son in ground so frozen he needed an axe to break the earth. He knew what a dead child looked like. This one was still fighting. The wind howled through the trees as Gideon dropped to one knee. Beside her, her skin was the color of ash, her lips pale blue. He pulled off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her small frame. We lifted her. She weighed almost nothing. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and for one terrible moment, he thought he'd been wrong, that she was already gone. Then, her fingers twitched. Just once, just enough. Gideon turned and started the half-mile walk back to his cabin, his boots crunching through snow that came up past his knees. Every breath burned his lungs. The child's face was pressed against his chest, and he could feel the faint, irregular beat of her heart. Through the layers of clothing, he moved faster. The sky above was the color of steel, promising more snow before nightfall. His property sat at the edge of territory where white settlers rarely ventured anymore. Too many raids, too many bodies, too much bad blood. Gideon had stayed because he had nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose. But carrying a Comanche child toward his home changed that calculation in ways he hadn't yet let himself consider. His cabin appeared through the trees, small and weathered, smoke rising from the chimney. He kicked the door open and carried the girl inside, laying her on the floor near the fire. Her breathing was so shallow he had to watch her chest carefully to see it rise and fall. He stripped away her wet clothing with quick, efficient movements, wrapping her in wool blankets from his bed. Her skin was ice against his palms. He'd seen frostbite before. Her fingers and toes were dark at the tips. She might lose some. She might lose all of them. She might not wake up at all. Gideon built up the fire until the cabin was sweltering, then knelt beside her and began rubbing her limbs through the blankets, trying to force warmth back into her body. Her eyelids fluttered, but didn't open. Once she made a sound, a small whimper that cut through him like a blade. He thought of his son, of the fever that had taken him, of how helpless he'd felt watching the light fade from those small eyes. This child wouldn't die in his cabin, not if he could prevent it. But even as he worked, even as he watched color slowly returned to her cheeks, another thought crept into his mind like frost spreading across glass. Someone was looking for her. Someone who would follow her tracks through the snow. Someone who would see those tracks lead directly to his door. Gideon glanced toward the window. Darkness was falling fast. The storm was coming. And somewhere out there in the frozen wilderness, warriors were searching for a child who now lay unconscious in the home of a white man. He looked back at the girl. Her breathing was stronger now, more regular. She might survive the night. The question was whether he would survive the morning. Because when the sun rose and the Comanche came, and they would come, every moment of mercy he'd shown would look like something else. Entirely. It would look like theft. It would look like harm, and there would be no words he could speak, no gesture he could make that would bridge the gap between intention and perception. Not in time, not before they decided his fate. The girl's fingers curled slightly against the blanket, and Gideon felt the weight of the choice he'd already made. He couldn't undo it, wouldn't, even if he could. But the cost was coming. He could feel in his bones, and it would arrive with the dawn. The night stretched like a wound that wouldn't close. Gideon sat beside the fire, watching the girl breathe. Every few minutes, he'd check her pulse at her wrist, her neck, counting the beats. Against the seconds, too fast meant fever. Too slow meant she was slipping away. He kept the rhythm steady in his mind, a desperate math that might keep death at bay for one more hour. Outside, the wind screamed against the cabin walls. Snow piled against the window until he could barely see through the glass. The storm had come as promised, turning the world into white chaos. No, one could track through this. Not tonight, but when it passed, when the sky cleared and the sun rose, every footprint he'd made would be preserved in fresh powder like evidence carved in stone. The girl stirred around midnight. A small sound escaped her lips, something that might have been a word in a language Gideon didn't speak. Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. He dampened a cloth and pressed it to her forehead. Her skin was hot now, too hot, the pendulum swinging from freeze to fever. He'd seen this before, the body fighting itself, try to recover from cold so severe it damaged something deep inside. She needed medicine he didn't have. She needed help he couldn't give. All he could do was keep her warm, keep her breathing, and hope her young body was strong enough to win the battle on its own. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, Gideon made coffee. He didn't drink and stared at the door. His rifle leaned against the wall within reach. Not that it would matter. If warriors came in numbers, one rifle wouldn't save him. He'd be dead before he could reload. The smart thing would be to take the girl outside right now. Leave her wrapped in blankets near the tree inn where she'd be found quickly. Distance himself from the situation entirely. Let them think she'd crawl there on her own. But she'd die in minutes in this cold. And Gideon had already chosen his path when he'd lifted her from the snow. There was no walking it back now. The girl's eyes opened just before dawn, not all the way, just narrow slits that caught the firelight and reflected it back like chips of obsidian. She looked at Gideon without recognition, without fear, without anything he could read. Then her gaze moved slowly around the cabin, taking in the rough walls, the simple furniture, the rifle. When her eyes returned to him, something changed in her expression, not understanding exactly, but awareness. She knew she wasn't home. She knew she was with a stranger. Her small hand moved beneath the blankets, searching for something that wasn't there. A weapon, maybe, or a talisman, something familiar in a world that had become impossible overnight. Gideon held up his empty hands, palms out, the universal gesture of peace. The girl watched him with eyes far older than 8 years should hold. She didn't speak. Neither did he. What words could bridge this gap? What language could explain the choice he'd made and the danger it had created for both of them? Outside, the storm was dying. The wind scream had dropped to a moan, then to silence. Through the window, the first gray light of dawn began to seep across the snow. The girl saw it, too. Her body went rigid beneath the blankets, and her breathing quickened. She tried to sit up, gasped at the pain in her limbs, and fell back. Then she did something that made Gideon's blood turn cold. She looked toward the door and whispered. One word, a name, he thought, repeated twice, soft and urgent, a prayer or a warning. And somewhere in the distance, muffled by snow and walls and the last remnants of storm, came the sound Gideon had been dreading since the moment he'd found her. Horses, multiple horses, moving fast through the powder, closing the distance. They were here. Gideon moved. Without thinking, he scooped the girl from the floor, blankets and all, and kicked open the back door. The cold hit like a fist, but he was already running through knee-deep snow toward the barn. The cabin was a trap with one door and windows too small to escape through. The barn had space, had exits on 3 sides, had places to take cover if everything went wrong. The girl made a small sound against his chest, confused or frightened, but didn't struggle. She was too weak for that. Behind them, the sound of horses grew louder, coming from the east where the main trail cut through the property. Gideon crashed through the barn door and set the girl down in a pile of hay near the back wall. She looked up at him with those black eyes that seemed to see straight through to his bones. He held up one hand, the gesture clear even across language. Stay here. Don't move. She didn't respond, just pulled the blankets tighter and watched him. Gideon grabbed a pitchfork from the wall, more for appearance than use, and moved to the front of the barn. Through the gap in the door, he could see them now. 6 riders emerging from the tree inn like shadows given form. They moved in formation, practiced and precise, spreading out as they approached. War horses, not pack animals. Men dressed for hunting, for tracking, for violence if it came to that. The lead rider was broad-shouldered with streaks of gray in his long hair, his face marked with scars that spoke of battle survived. He raised one hand, and the group stopped 50 feet from the barn, forming a semicircle that blocked every visible exit. The barn was surrounded. Gideon's breathing came hard and fast, fogging the cold air. This was the moment the girl had feared, the moment he'd known was coming, since he'd wrapped his coat around her in the snow. They sat there on their horses, perfectly still, waiting for what? Gideon didn't know. For him to show himself, for him to harm their child, for him to make the first wrong move so they could justify what came next. He could feel their eyes on the barn, could sense the tension in their stillness. One of the younger warriors had a bow already strung, arrow notched, but not drawn. Another had a rifle across his lap, hands loose, but ready. They weren't here for conversation. They were here for their child, and nothing else mattered. Gideon looked back at the girl. She'd pushed herself up against the wall, her small face pale but alert. She was staring at the door, and he could see her lips moving, forming words too quiet to hear. Then she did something that changed everything. She tried to stand. Her legs buckled immediately, sending her back to the hay, with a gasp of pain. But she tried again, gritting her teeth, forcing her frozen limbs to obey. She was trying to go to them, trying to show herself, trying to prove she was alive. Gideon moved toward her, hands out, meaning only to steady her. But from outside came a shout, sharp and commanding, the sound of horses shifting, weapons being readied. They'd seen movement through the gaps in the barn walls. They'd seen him approach the child, and in that moment, without words or weapons or any chance to explain everything he'd done, to save her life looked like something else entirely. The lead warrior dismounted in one smooth motion, for others followed. They were coming in, and Gideon was standing between them and their daughter with a pitchfork in his hands, and no way to make them understand that he was the reason she was still breathing. The barn door exploded inward with a force that sent splinters flying. The lead warrior entered first, moving with the controlled violence of a man who'd done this 100 times before. His eyes swept the interior in one swift scan, identifying threats, exits, weapons. They locked onto Gideon, then onto the pitchfork in his hands, then onto the small figure behind him in the hay. The warrior's face didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. A tightening of the shoulders, a subtle repositioning of weight. He was preparing to kill. Gideon dropped the pitchfork. The metal hit the dirt floor with a dull thud that seemed impossibly loud in the frozen silence. He raised his hands slowly, palms out, fingers spread, the universal language of surrender. But surrender wasn't what the warrior saw. He saw a white man standing between him and his child. He saw blankets that might hide injuries. He saw a situation that had only one logical explanation, and that explanation ended with Gideon's blood in the snow. The girl's voice cut through the tension like a knife. Small and weak but urgent. She spoke rapidly in her language, words tumbling over each other as she pushed herself forward in the hay. The lead warrior's head snapped toward her. For the first time, emotion cracked through his stone expression. Relief, raw and immediate. He moved toward her, 2 long strides that closed the distance. Then he stopped. She was wrapped in a white man's blankets. Her wet clothes hung on a nail near the wall, steaming in the barn's relative warmth. She'd been undressed, changed, handled. The warrior's hand moved to the knife at his belt. Behind him, the other warriors spread out, forming a wall between Gideon and the only exit. One of them had his bow drawn now, arrow aimed at Gideon's chest. The distance was maybe 15 feet at that range. He wouldn't miss. The girl spoke again, louder this time, her voice breaking with effort. She pointed at Gideon with one small hand, then at herself, then made a gesture Gideon didn't understand. The lead warrior looked at her, then at Gideon, then back at her. Something passed between them. A question asked and answered. But whatever she'd said hadn't changed the mathematics of the situation. Gideon was still a white man who'd taken a Comanche child, who'd removed her clothing, who'd kept her overnight in his barn. No matter her words, no matter his intentions, the facts arranged themselves into a story that had only one ending. The warrior spoke for the first time. His voice was deep and controlled, each word measured like a blade being drawn. Gideon didn't understand the language, but he understood the tone. It was a question or maybe an accusation. Maybe both. Gideon pointed at the girl, then at the ground, making a gesture, like something falling. He pointed at the fire visible through the barn door, then wrapped his arms around himself and shivered. He was trying to mime the story. Girl in snow, brought to warmth, safe from cold. The warrior watched without expression. Then he turned to one of the younger men and spoke. Rapidly, the younger warrior moved forward, circling wide to avoid getting between the archer and Gideon. He knelt beside the girl, checking her carefully. His hands moved over her limbs with practiced efficiency, the touch of someone who'd assessed injuries before. He looked at her fingers and toes, darkened by frostbite, but not black, still salvageable. He examined her face, her neck, searching for marks that weren't there. Then he looked up at the lead warrior and spoke. 3 words, calm and factual. The lead warrior's eyes closed for just a moment. When they opened, some of the killing tension had drained from his shoulders, but not all of it. Not nearly all of it, because the girl might be alive, might be unharmed. But that didn't erase the fundamental problem Gideon had taken her. And now they had to decide what price that choice carried. The girl spoke again. This time, she wasn't looking at her father. She was looking at Gideon. Her small hand reached out from the blankets, fingers stretching toward him across the space between them. She said something too, words repeated twice with an inflection that sounded almost like gratitude. The lead warrior's jaw tightened. He moved forward and carefully gathered the girl into his arms. She wrapped her thin arms around his neck and buried her face against his shoulder. For a moment, the warrior's eyes closed, and Gideon saw something he recognized in the lines of that scarred face. The terror of almost losing a child, the relief of holding them again. The warrior held her like she was made of glass, like if he squeezed too hard, she might shatter. Then he turned those dark eyes back to Gideon, and the gratitude Gideon had dared to hope for wasn't there. Only calculation, only caution. The warrior carried the girl toward the door, speaking quietly to her in their language. The other warriors began to pull back, maintaining their formation, but creating space for their leader to exit. This should have been the end of it. They had what they came for. They could leave. But one of the younger warriors said something sharp and pointed at the ground near where the girl had been lying. The lead warrior stopped, turned, looked. There in the hay was a small leather pouch, half hidden by the blankets. The warrior shifted the girl in his arms and gestured with his chin. The younger man picked up the pouch and opened it carefully. He pulled out what looked like dried herbs wrapped in cloth. Medicine. Traditional medicine that the girl must have been carrying when she got lost. The warrior's expression darkened. He looked at Gideon and spoke. The tone had changed. Harder now, more demanding. He repeated the words, gesturing at the pouch, at the girl, at Gideon. Gideon shook his head, not understanding. The warrior's hand went back to his knife. One of the other men translated, speaking broken English with a thick accent. Where you find her, show. It wasn't a request. Gideon's mind raced. They wanted to know where he'd found her. Why? To verify his story. To see if there were others to understand how she'd gotten so far from wherever they'd been. He pointed north toward the clearing with the oak tree. The warrior studied him for a long moment, then gave a sharp command. 2 of the warriors moved to flank Gideon. They wanted him to lead them there. Now, with armed men at his back, and no guarantee they'd let him return, but the girl spoke again from her father's arms. She pointed at Gideon, then at herself, then made a cradling motion. She was telling them what happened, how he'd carried her, how he'd saved her. The laid warrior listened, his face unreadable. When she finished, he was quiet for several heartbeats. Then he looked at Gideon with eyes that held something different than before. Not trust exactly, but perhaps the absence of active hostility. It was the most Gideon could hope for. One of the warriors brought forward a horse. The lead warrior mounted, carefully settling the girl in front of him, wrapped in both her blankets and his own heavy robe. She looked so small against his broad chest, so fragile but alive. Her eyes found Gideon one last time, and she lifted one small hand in a gesture that might have been goodbye or might have been something else, something that acknowledged a debt that would never be spoken aloud. The warrior looked down at Gideon from his horse. He spoke 3 words in his language, slow and deliberate. Then he turned his horse and rode toward the tree and the girl, secure in his arms. The other warriors followed, their formation tight and protective. They didn't look back. Within moments, they disappeared into the forest, leaving only tracks in the snow and the echo of hoof beats fading into silence. Gideon stood alone in the barn doorway, his hands still shaking from fear and cold and something he couldn't name. It was over. He'd survived. The girl would live. But as he turned back toward his cabin, as his eyes swept across his property to the tree in where they'd vanished, he saw something that made his blood freeze. Fresh tracks in the snow, not from the direction the warriors had come, from the west. Multiple sets, heavy boots, and they led straight toward his cabin. White men had been here while he'd been in the barn, while the warriors had been inside, and they'd seen everything. Gideon followed the tracks with his eyes, counting the boot prints in the fresh snow. For men, maybe 5. They'd approached from the west ridge, moving carefully, using the trees for cover. They'd stopped at the edge of the clearing, where they would have had a clear view of the barn. They'd watched the entire confrontation, watch Comanche warriors surround his property, watch them enter his barn, watch them leave with the girl. And now those same men knew that Gideon Pratt had harbored a Comanche child, that he'd let warriors leave his land without firing a shot, that he'd chosen mercy over loyalty to his own kind, in a territory where trust was measured in blood, and every choice had consequences. He just painted a target on his back that no amount of explanation could erase. He walked to where the tracks began, following them back toward the ridge. The men hadn't tried to hide their presence. The prints were deep and careless, made by people who didn't fear being followed. At the ridge, the tracks continued west toward the settlement, toward town, toward people who would hear this story and make it into something worse than it was. Gideon stood there in the cold morning air, his breath forming clouds, and felt the weight of isolation pressed down on him like a physical thing. He'd been alone before, but this was different. This was the kind of alone that came with being marked as a traitor, the kind that ended with a rope, or a bullet, or simply being driven out into the winter to freeze. He walked back to his cabin and barred the door. His rifle went across his lap as he sat in the chair facing the entrance. The fire had burned down to coals. He didn't rebuild it. He just sat there in the growing cold and thought about choices and consequences in the narrow space between doing what was right and surviving what came after. The girl was alive, that mattered, but the cost was still being calculated, and he had a feeling the bill would come due sooner than he wanted. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, turning the snow into a field of blinding white. No one came, but that didn't mean they wouldn't. Around midday, Gideon heard it. Horses. Again, multiple horses coming fast from the west. He moved to the window and looked out through the gap in the shutters. 6 riders, white men. He recognized 3 of them from town. Settlers who ran cattle on the northern range. Hard men who'd lost family to raids over the years. Men who saw every Comanche as an enemy, and every white man who helped them as something worse. They rode straight up to his cabin and stopped in a line facing the door. The one in front was named Dalton Keene. He had a scar that ran from his eye to his jaw, a souvenir from a knife fight years back. He was known for two things: a quick temper and a long memory. Dalton didn't dismount. He just sat there on his horse, looking at the cabin like it was something diseased. When he spoke, his voice carried easily across the snow. "Pratt, we need to talk about what happened here this morning." Gideon didn't respond, didn't open the door, didn't show himself at the window. Dalton shifted in his saddle. "We saw them, so you let them walk right off. Your property, so you standing there like you were saying goodbye to old friends." The other men murmured. Agreement. One of them spat in the snow. Dalton continued. "Now I'm trying to understand this, Pratt. Trying to give you the benefit of the doubt. So I'm asking you to come out here and explain yourself. Tell us why we shouldn't ride into town right now and let everyone know you're sheltering the enemy." Gideon's hands tightened on his rifle. There was no good answer, no explanation that would satisfy men who'd already made up their minds. If he told them the truth, they'd call him a liar or a fool. If he stayed silent, they'd assume the worst. And the worst in this territory, in these times, was enough to get a man killed. Dalton waited. When no response came, his voice hardened. "Have it your way. But you should know something, Pratt. You just made a choice. And choices like that, they don't get forgotten out here. They get remembered. And they get paid back." The riders turned their horses and rode west back toward town, back toward people who would listen to their story and spread it like wildfire. Gideon watched them disappear, knowing that when they returned, and they would return, they wouldn't be coming to talk. Night came early. Gideon kept a fire low and the lamp unlit. He moved through his cabin in darkness, checking the windows, the door, the gaps in the walls where cold air and maybe worse things could slip through. His rifle stayed within arm's reach. He loaded it twice, unloaded it twice, his hands moving through the familiar motions while his mind worked through scenarios that all ended badly. The settlement would come. For him. Not tonight maybe, but soon. They'd come with torches and rope and righteous anger. And there would be no trial, no chance to explain, just swift frontier justice for a man who'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Around midnight, he heard something. Outside. Not horses this time. Footsteps. Soft and careful moving. Around the perimeter of the cabin. Gideon moved to the window, rifle ready, trying to see through the darkness. A shadow passed near the barn. Then another. Two figures, maybe three, circling his property like wolves testing a wounded animal. They weren't making any effort to hide their presence. Now, they wanted him to know they were there. Wanted him to feel the pressure of being watched. Wanted him to understand that he was surrounded and there was nowhere to run. Then came a knock. 3 sharp raps on the door that echoed through the small space like gunshots. Gideon's finger tightened on the trigger. The knock came again, more insistent. A voice followed. Not Dalton's voice, not English. Gideon's. Blood turned to ice. He moved to the door, his ear pressed against the rough wood. The voice came again, speaking in the Comanche language, the words rapid and urgent. Then silence. Gideon waited, his heart hammering against his ribs. He couldn't open that door. If it was the warriors back for revenge, he was dead. If it was a trick by the settlers, he was dead. But if it was something else, if they'd come back for a reason he couldn't guess, then not opening the door might be an insult that cost him everything. He made his choice. He pulled back the bar and opened the door. A cracked rifle pointed at whoever stood on the other side. The lead warrior was there. Royce Bannon, though Gideon didn't know his name, the man who'd held his daughter like she was made of glass. But he wasn't alone. 2 other warriors flanked him, their faces hard and watchful. And behind them, barely visible in the darkness, were more shapes, more horses, more men. Royce spoke, his voice low and controlled. The words meant nothing to Gideon, but the tone was clear. This wasn't a social call. Royce gestured back toward the trees, toward something Gideon couldn't see. Then he made a motion with his hands that Gideon understood. Riders coming, many of them. Understanding hit Gideon like a fist. The settlers weren't waiting until morning. They were coming tonight. And somehow the Comanche knew, had seen them gathering, had tracked them moving through the darkness toward this isolated cabin where a man who'd save a child was about to pay for that mercy. Royce spoke again, his hand moving in sharp gestures. He was offering something, warning or help, or some combination of both. But why? Why? Would warriors who'd almost killed him hours ago come back to warn him of danger? Royce must have seen the confusion on Gideon's face because he did something unexpected. He touched his chest, then pointed at Gideon, then made the same cradling gesture his daughter had made. Debt. That's what he was saying. A debt owed for a life saved. The sound of horses rose in the distance, coming from the west. The settlers were close now, minutes away at most. Roy spoke sharply to his warriors. They moved quickly, disappearing into the shadows around the cabin. Royce looked at Gideon one last time, his scarred face unreadable in the dim light. Then he too vanished into the darkness, leaving Gideon standing alone in his doorway with his rifle and a situation that had just become impossibly more complicated. Because now, the settlers were riding toward his cabin, expecting to find him alone and defenseless. Instead, they were about to ride into a trap they didn't know existed. And Gideon was standing in the middle of it all, knowing that whatever happened in the next few minutes would either save his life or end it. The sound of approaching horses grew louder. Torchlight flickered through the trees. Voices called out in the darkness. Hard and angry. They were here. The settlers came with torches held high and rifles across their saddles. 8 men this time, not 6. They rode in tight formation, their faces hard with purpose in the flickering light. Dalton Keene led them, his scarred face twisted with righteousness. They stopped 30 feet from the cabin, spreading out in a line that blocked any escape. Gideon stood in his doorway, rifle in hand, knowing he couldn't win this fight. 8 against 1. The math was simple and brutal. Dalton dismounted slowly, his hand resting on his pistol. Last chance, Pratt. Come out peaceable and we'll make this quick fight, and it'll be slow. Gideon's grip tightened on his rifle. He'd made peace with dying years ago when he'd buried his family. But going out like this, hunted down for saving a child, felt like a waste of whatever years he had left. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some defense or explanation that wouldn't matter. Then the shadows moved. Roy stepped from the darkness near the barn, his rifle leveled at Dalton's back. 2 more warriors emerged from behind the cabin. Another appeared on the roof, bow drawn. 3 more materialized from the tree inn, silent as ghosts. In seconds, the settlers found themselves surrounded by Comanche warriors who'd been there all along, invisible until the moment they chose to be seen. The settlers' horses skittered nervously, sensing the sudden shift in power. Dalton froze, his hand still on his pistol, but not drawing it. One wrong move, and this field would turn into a massacre. Royce spoke, his English broken, but clear enough. You go now. Dalton's jaw worked, rage and fear warring on his face. This doesn't concern you. This is between white men. Royce moved forward 1 step, his rifle never wavering. He saved my daughter, I save him. Debt paid, you go. The weight of those words hung in the cold air. A life for a life. The oldest, lawer than treaties or territories or the lines men drew between peoples. One of the other settlers, a younger man named Curtis, spoke up. Dalton, we should go. This isn't worth it. Dalton's face flushed red. He helped them. He's a traitor to his own kind. Royce's voice cut through the tension like a blade. He helped child. You want kill man for that? The question sat there impossible to answer without revealing the ugliness at the heart of their mission. They'd come to kill a man for showing mercy, for choosing humanity over hatred. And now they were being forced to look at that choice clearly without the comfortable distance of righteousness. Slowly, grudgingly, Dalton raised his hands away from his pistol. This isn't over, Pratt. You can't hide behind them. Forever. But he was already turning his horse, and the others followed. They rode west into the darkness, their torches growing smaller until they disappeared entirely. The Comanche warriors didn't move until the sound of Hoof beatots had faded completely. Then, one by one, they melted back into the shadows. Royce was the last to leave. He walked to where Gideon stood and stopped. For a long moment, the two men looked at each other across the space that separated their worlds. Royce reached into his coat and pulled out something small, the medicine pouch his daughter had been carrying. He held it out to Gideon. When Gideon took it, Royce spoke in his own language. Gideon didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. The debt was paid. They were even. Royce turned and walked into the darkness, disappearing as completely as if he'd never been there at all. Gideon stood alone in the silence that followed. The medicine pouch was soft in his hands, still carrying the faint warmth of Royce's body. He looked at his cabin, at his land, at the snow that would melt and reveal nothing of what had happened here. The settlers would return eventually, or they wouldn't. The Comanche would pass through this territory again, or they wouldn't. But tonight, in this moment, a child was alive because he'd chosen mercy, and he'd survived because that mercy had been repaid. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't friendship. It was simply recognition that some debts transcended the boundaries men drew between themselves. Gideon walked back into his cabin and closed the door. The fire had gone out completely, but for the first time in years, the cold didn't bother him quite so much. He'd saved a life, and in doing so, he'd remembered what it felt like to be human again. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage and compassion collide in unexpected ways. Don't forget to subscribe and consider Super Chat too. Help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.